You know, for decades, whenever we talked about heart disease, the conversation always, and I mean always, came back to cholesterol. But what if that's only half the story? Well, today, we're digging into a major new scientific statement from the American College of Cardiology that officially puts a totally new target in the crosshairs: inflammation.
So let's start with a question that has really been bugging doctors and patients for years. You do everything right, you get your LDL, your bad cholesterol down to a great level, your blood pressure is looking good, but for some reason, the risk of a heart attack or stroke never quite goes to zero. Why is that? Well, it turns out there's another major hidden factor at play.
And this is it. This is the crucial missing piece. The experts have even given it a name: residual inflammatory risk. The best way to think about it is like a slow, smoldering fire inside your arteries. Even if you don't have a lot of cholesterol building up, this chronic, low-grade inflammation can make any plaque you do have really unstable and way more likely to cause a major problem.
So here's what we're going to cover in this explainer. We'll start by looking at the evidence for this other half of risk. Then we'll get into why the experts decided a big update was needed right now. We'll break down their new recommendations and, of course, talk about what this all means for you. We'll also touch on the unanswered questions before we get to the new bottom line.
All right, let's dive in with the evidence. Why is inflammation, after all these years, suddenly taking center stage?
Okay, this slide shows it all in a really powerful way. This data comes from a huge study. We're talking nearly 28,000 women followed for 3 decades. On the top, you can see the risk based on inflammation levels, which they measured with a marker called hsCRP. On the bottom, you see the risk based on LDL cholesterol. Just look at the lines. The slope is obviously steeper for inflammation, which tells us that it was actually a better predictor of who would end up having a heart attack or stroke down the line.
And this right here, this illustrates the challenge that cardiologists have been facing. What this data shows is that even for patients who are already on statins, who have fantastic cholesterol control, LDL levels below 70, if their inflammation was still high, their risk of cardiovascular death was still way up there. That gap, that persistent risk, is exactly why the American College of Cardiology knew it was time for a major reevaluation.
So, after more than 20 years of evidence piling up since the last big statement back in 2002, a committee of some of the world's leading cardiologists got together. Their mission was pretty clear: create a new playbook, a new consensus on how to finally deal with this inflammatory risk.
Now, the key to all of this was having a standardized, reliable, and honestly simple way to measure this chronic low-grade inflammation. And for that, they zeroed in on one specific biomarker: high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hsCRP. It's a simple blood test, that's all, but it can reveal the level of this silent inflammation that might be humming along in your body.
And the great thing is, the results are really easy to understand. If your hsCRP level is below 1 milligram per liter, that's considered lower risk. If it's between 1 and 3, that's sort of an average or moderate risk. And if your level is above 3, that points to a higher inflammatory risk. It gives doctors a clear, concrete number to work with, just like they have for cholesterol or blood pressure.
Okay, so armed with all this data and a reliable test, what did the committee actually recommend? Let's get into the new clinical guidance they've laid out.
This table really gets to the core of it. First, and this is a big one, they're recommending universal screening with hsCRP for pretty much everyone, whether you have known heart disease or not. Second, for primary prevention, that means people who haven't had a heart attack. If your inflammation is high, that should trigger a conversation about statins, even if your cholesterol is normal. And finally, for patients who already have heart disease, they're highlighting the first FDA-approved anti-inflammatory drug specifically for atherosclerosis, which is low-dose colchicine.
But, and this is really important, before jumping to any medications, the committee was crystal clear that lifestyle is your first line of defense. All of the things we kind of know are good for us, like a Mediterranean diet, getting regular exercise, not smoking, and keeping a healthy weight, it turns out they are all powerful, natural anti-inflammatories.
Okay, so let's break down what these recommendations really mean in practice. The approach is a bit different depending on whether you're trying to prevent a first heart attack or a second one.
For primary prevention, the Jupiter trial is really the key piece of evidence. This study was a total game changer. It looked at people who, based on their cholesterol alone, would not have been given a statin, but they all had elevated hsCRP. And the results were just stunning. Giving them a statin slashed their risk of a first heart attack or stroke by almost 50%. This is the data that proves treating inflammation directly is worth it, even when cholesterol looks just fine. Now, for secondary prevention, patients who already have heart disease, the science gets even more specific. It turns out not just any anti-inflammatory drug will work. As you can see here, the trials that succeeded with drugs like canakinumab and colchicine worked because they specifically lowered key inflammatory markers. The trial that failed, which used methotrexate, didn't work because, well, that drug didn't actually lower those same markers. So the takeaway is crucial. The treatment has to be targeted to the right inflammatory pathway.
Now, in the spirit of being evidence first, it's just as important to talk about what this new statement doesn't solve, right? The science is always evolving, and the committee was very upfront about the gaps that still exist in our knowledge. Researchers are still trying to figure out some pretty big questions. For example, while we have drugs like colchicine for secondary prevention, we don't yet have dedicated anti-inflammatory therapies that are proven to work for primary prevention. We're also still learning how to best combine blood tests with advanced imaging, figuring out the perfect time to start therapy, and how our own individual genetics might play a role in all of this.
So, with all that said, what's the ultimate takeaway? Where does this new science leave us?
I think this quote from the statement itself just says it best. The science has officially moved from being an interesting theory to a clinical reality. The consensus is that inflammation is a direct, causal, and most importantly, treatable factor in heart disease. The time for just watching it is over. The time for acting on it is here.
So, for you, this really all boils down to 3 simple steps. First, measure it. You can't treat what you don't measure, so ask your doctor about getting an hsCRP test. Second, modify. Focus on those powerful anti-inflammatory lifestyle changes. And third, if you have established heart disease, manage that risk by talking to your doctor about targeted therapies.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. For decades, getting your cholesterol checked has just been a normal part of any checkup. Given this powerful new evidence, the question isn't really if inflammation matters anymore, but how quickly we're going to make testing for it a standard part of care. Will checking your hsCRP soon be just as routine? Based on this report, the answer seems to be a resounding yes.